Richard threw my suitcase out the door without looking at me. Not his suitcase, mine. My mother's old leather case, worn at the corners, that she'd had since before I was born. He threw it like it was rubbish. Like I was rubbish. The baby was 6 weeks old. I was still bleeding. And he had a younger woman waiting in a car outside while he told me the house was in his name and I needed to leave. He thought he knew exactly what I had. He had calculated everything with the cold precision of a man who had been planning this moment for months while sleeping beside me every night. What he didn't know was that inside that suitcase, the one he threw without a second thought, there was a hidden pocket. And inside that pocket, a letter from my mother. She had been dead for 2 years, but she had left me something. And Richard, in all his certainty that he was leaving me with nothing, had handed it to me with his own hands. I want to tell you about the man Richard was, not the man he pretended to be in front of other people. The reasonable one, the practical one, the one who always had a sensible explanation for everything. I want to tell you about the one I lived with. He had known about my mother's property since the week she died. He went through her papers before I did. I found that out later, much later, but when I did, it confirmed something I had felt for a long time without being able to name it. Richard had a way of knowing things and deciding, quietly and alone, what those things were worth. And if he decided something wasn't worth much, he simply didn't mention it. A small piece of moorland and a broken-down cottage in Yorkshire. That's what he saw when he read my mother's papers. Nothing. Not worth mentioning. Not worth registering in his calculations of what we had and what we didn't have. So he said nothing. And I never knew. We had been married for 4 years when he left. I had given up my job when the baby came. The house was in his name. He had insisted on that when we bought it, for reasons he explained so reasonably that I hadn't questioned them at the time. The savings account was in his name. The car was in his name. I had been so certain that his name and my name meant the same thing. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a great many things where Richard was concerned, but I was most wrong about that. The morning he left, he didn't argue. That was the thing I kept coming back to afterward. There was no fight, no raised voices, no moment where it could have gone differently. He had simply come downstairs with his bag already packed, set it by the door, and told me. He had met someone. It had been going on for some time. He was sorry, but he thought it was better to be honest. I was standing in the kitchen holding the baby. Clara was 6 weeks old and had been up 3 times in the night, and I hadn't slept properly in longer than I could remember. I looked at Richard across the kitchen and I thought, he practiced this. He stood in front of a mirror somewhere and practiced saying these words until they came out clean and reasonable and final. I didn't cry. Not then. I couldn't find the feeling yet. It was there somewhere underneath everything, I knew that, but it hadn't reached the surface. I asked him about the house. He told me. I asked him about the savings. He told me that too. I stood very still while he explained it all, while he laid out with calm and terrible clarity exactly what belonged to him and what belonged to me, which turned out to be almost the same list. When he finished, I looked at him for a long moment and I thought about 4 years, about the person I had been when I met him, and the person I was now, and how much of the distance between those two people was because of choices I had made and how much was because of him. I didn't say any of that. I just said, I need you to leave now. He nodded. He picked up his bag, and on his way out, he picked up my mother's old suitcase from the hallway, the one I used for everything because we only had the one, and threw it out the front door onto the path. He didn't look back. I stood in the kitchen with Clara against my chest and listened to the car start and pull away, and I waited until the sound had completely disappeared before I sat down on the floor and allowed myself to feel what had just happened. I had nowhere to go. That was the simple flat truth of it. My mother was gone. I had a sister in Edinburgh who I hadn't spoken to properly in 2 years. Richard had never liked her, and somewhere along the way, I had allowed that to matter more than it should have. I had friends, or I had thought I had friends, but they turned out to be the kind that belonged to a life rather than to a person, and the life was Richard's. I sat on the floor of that kitchen for a long time. Clara slept. Outside, the day continued as if nothing had happened. A neighbour walked past with a dog. A car went by. Someone's radio played faintly through an open window. I kept thinking, someone should know this is happening. Someone should notice. Nobody noticed. Eventually, I got up. I made tea because I didn't know what else to do, and my mother had always said that tea was something to do with your hands when your mind couldn't manage anything more complicated. I drank it, standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the garden Richard had never bothered with, and I thought, right, what do I actually have? I had Clara. I had the clothes in my wardrobe, which were technically mine. I had £11 in my purse. I had my mother's suitcase on the front path. I went and picked it up. It was heavier than it should have been for an empty case, and I remember thinking that Richard had probably thrown it hard enough to break something. I brought it inside and laid it on the bed and opened it to check, running my hands around the inside, lining the way I always did, because the lining had always been slightly loose on one side, and things got caught under it. My fingers found the pocket. I had forgotten it existed. My mother had shown it to me once years ago. A pocket sewn into the lining, hidden, the kind of thing that required knowing exactly where to press. She had sewn it herself. She had said, for things worth keeping safe. Inside, it was an envelope. My name on the front in her handwriting. I sat down on the edge of the bed and held it for a moment before I opened it. The letter was 4 pages long. My mother's handwriting, careful and slightly slanted the way it always was, covering both sides of each page with the particular thoroughness of a woman who wanted to make sure she was understood. She had written it 2 months before she died. She had known she was ill, more ill than she had told me. I understood reading it, more ill than she had told anyone. She had wanted to put things in order while she still could. The first page was about ordinary things. How much she loved me. How proud she was. How she hoped I was happy. And here she'd written Richard's name with the careful neutrality of a woman who had reservations she had chosen not to voice while she was alive. The second page was about the property. Her mother, my grandmother, had left her a small piece of land in Yorkshire, a few acres of moorland near a village called Ashworth, with a cottage on it that had been in the family since the 1920s. My mother had grown up spending summers there. When my grandmother died, she had inherited it outright, and she had kept it quietly all her married life, paying the small annual fees to keep it registered, never mentioning it to anyone because it had never seemed relevant, and because some things, she wrote, are worth keeping to yourself. She was leaving it to me. Not to me and Richard, to me. She had been specific about that. She had consulted a solicitor and been specific, and the deed, she wrote, was registered at the land registry in my name alone. She included the solicitor's details on the 3rd page, and the address of the cottage, and a description of where the spare key was kept. Under the 3rd stone to the left of the front step, which she acknowledged was not very imaginative, but had served perfectly well for 40 years. The 4th page was shorter. It said, I don't know what your life will look like when you read this. I hope it looks like happiness. But if it doesn't, if things have gone wrong in ways neither of us expected, I want you to know that this place is yours. It has always been yours. Your grandmother raised me there, and I want it to raise something in you, too. Whatever you need it to raise. Go there if you need to. It will be waiting. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it carefully and put it back in the hidden pocket where my mother had left it. Then I picked Clara up from the bed where she had been sleeping and held her very tightly for a moment. Then I started packing. I took the bus. 2 buses, actually, with a change in Leeds that took 40 minutes and involved sitting on a cold plastic seat in a bus station with Clara in my arms and my mother's suitcase at my feet and £11 in my purse, which was enough for the tickets and not much else. I had called the solicitor from a phone box before I left. A man named Mr. Aldridge, practising in Harrogate, who had been my mother's solicitor for 20 years and who spoke to me with the careful kindness of someone delivering news they hoped would land well. He confirmed everything the letter had said. The property was registered in my name. Had been since my mother had updated her will 3 years earlier. There were no outstanding debts on it, no complications, no competing claims. He asked if I needed anything else. I said, "I just need to know it's real." He said, "It's real, Mrs. Calloway. It's entirely and completely yours." I hung up the phone and stood in the phone box for a moment, with my hand still on the receiver. Outside, the street continued, people walking past, a car, someone arguing at a shop door. I thought about Richard sitting somewhere with his new woman, satisfied with his calculations, certain he had accounted for everything. He had gone through my mother's papers and seen a piece of moorland and a broken-down cottage, and decided it wasn't worth mentioning. He had been wrong, but not in the way I understood yet. I didn't know then about the grazing rights. I didn't know what they were worth, or what they meant, or why a solicitor who had known my mother for 20 years had chosen his words so carefully when he said the property had no complications. I just knew the cottage existed, and that it was mine, and that I had £11 and a baby and nowhere else to go. I picked up the suitcase, settled Clara against my chest, and got on the bus. The village of Ashworth was smaller than I had imagined. A single main street, a post office, a pub, a church with a graveyard that looked older than everything else combined. The bus stopped at the end of the main street, and I was the only one who got off. The address in my mother's letter led me down a lane that ran along the edge of the village and then out onto open moorland, narrowing as it went until it was barely wide enough for a car. I walked it with Clara against my chest and the suitcase in my hand, and the October wind coming off the moor in a way that made me glad I had worn my heavy coat. The cottage appeared around a bend, and my first thought was that my mother had been generous in calling it a cottage. It was small, stone walls the colour of the moorland around it, a slate roof with a visible sag on the left side, windows so dirty the glass had gone almost opaque. The garden, if you could call it that, was entirely given over to weeds and dead grass. The front gate hung at an angle that suggested the hinges had given up some years ago. I stood at the end of the path and looked at it. I had left a house that morning, a proper house and a functioning kitchen and a garden. Richard had never bothered with, but which had at least been a garden. I had left it because a man had calculated that I was worth less than everything in it and had arranged things accordingly. And now I was standing in front of this. I thought about crying. The feeling was there, close to the surface, the same feeling that had been waiting since that morning in the kitchen. But I looked at the cottage, and I thought about my mother writing the letter and consulting the solicitor and sewing the pocket into the lining of the suitcase and hiding it there for me to find. And I thought, she believed this was enough. She knew what it was, and she believed it was enough. Before I went inside, I walked back to the village. There was a small shop on the main street, the kind that sold everything from candles to tinned food without making any distinction between them. I bought bread, a tin of soup, a tin of sardines, matches, and 2 candles. The woman behind the counter didn't ask questions. She took my money and gave me my change, and that was the entirety of our interaction, which was exactly what I needed. I had £7 and 4 shillings left. I knew how long that had to last, and I bought accordingly. Then I walked back down the lane to the cottage and I found the key under the third stone to the left of the front step, exactly where she had said it would be. I opened the door and went inside. The inside was cold and smelled of damp and the particular stillness of a place that hasn't been breathed in for a long time. But it was solid. That was the first thing I noticed. The walls were solid, the floor was solid, the ceiling was intact. Whatever else needed doing, the bones of the place were sound. There were 2 rooms downstairs and 2 up. The kitchen had an old range that I wasn't sure still worked, and a sink with a single tap that produced, after some persuasion, actual running water. The sitting room had a fireplace with a good stack of old logs beside it that had dried out completely and would burn well. Upstairs, a bedroom with an iron bed frame and a mattress that I decided not to examine too closely, and a smaller room that had clearly been used for storage and still held, under a layer of dust, several boxes I recognised as my mother's handwriting on the sides. I put Clara down on the sitting room floor on the blanket I'd brought and I lit the fire. It took 4 attempts and most of the matches, but it caught eventually, and the room began, slowly and reluctantly, to warm. I made a list while I waited. I had always made lists when things felt unmanageable. It was something my mother had taught me, the same way she had taught me about tea. You write down what needs doing, she used to say, and then it stops living only in your head, where it can be as large as it wants to be, and becomes a series of actual things with actual solutions. The list was long. The roof needed assessing. The range needed cleaning before I could use it. The windows needed washing. The garden needed clearing before winter made it impossible. The mattress needed replacing. The walls in the kitchen needed something. Plaster, paint, I wasn't sure yet. At the bottom of the list I wrote, "Find out about the grazing rights." Mr. Aldridge had mentioned them at the end of our phone call, almost as an afterthought. Something about rights attached to the land that would be worth looking into. He had said it in the careful way of someone who has more to say, but is waiting to be asked. I hadn't asked. I had been too focused on getting here. I looked at the words at the bottom of my list and thought, tomorrow. Tonight I had a fire and 4 walls, and my daughter, and that was enough. I called Mr. Aldridge from the village phone box the following morning. Clara came with me, as she came everywhere, strapped to my chest in the carrier I had packed without knowing quite why, and now couldn't imagine being without. It was cold enough that I could see my breath, and the moorland around the village was the particular grey of an English October that has decided to stay. I had slept badly on the old mattress, and woken twice in the night to feed Clara, and once more just from the unfamiliar sounds of a stone cottage settling in the cold. And I was tired in the deep way that had become simply the texture of my days. Mr. Aldridge answered on the second ring. I told him I was at the cottage. I told him I had read the letter and understood the situation, and that I wanted to know about the grazing rights. There was a pause, not a long one, just long enough for me to understand that what he was about to say was something he had been waiting to tell me properly. The grazing rights, he explained, had been attached to the land since the 19th century. They were common grazing rights, the legal entitlement to graze livestock on a much larger area of surrounding moorland, rights that had been registered with the land for generations and transferred with it each time it changed hands. My grandmother had held them. My mother had held them. I held them now. I said, "What does that mean in practical terms?" He said, "It means that the value of your property is considerably more than the cottage and the few acres around it might suggest. Grazing rights of this kind are increasingly sought after. There are farmers in the area who would pay a significant annual fee to lease them." He paused again. Your mother was aware of this. She had been approached twice in the last 10 years by local farming interests. She had declined both times because she wasn't sure what you might want to do with the land. I stood in the phone box with Clara asleep against my chest and the receiver in my hand, and I thought about Richard going through my mother's papers. I thought about him reading the address and seeing a broken-down cottage on a piece of moorland, and deciding it wasn't worth mentioning. I thought about how certain he had been, how careful, how calculated, how completely, catastrophically wrong. I said, "Mr. Aldridge, what would a fair annual lease look like?" He told me. I thanked him and hung up the phone and stood very still in the phone box for a moment. Then I walked back to the cottage, sat down at the kitchen table, and added one more line to my list. Call Mr. Aldridge back. Accept the offer. The first winter was the hardest thing I had ever done. I want to be honest about that. I have heard stories about women who found themselves in impossible situations and rose to meet them with a grace and competence that seemed to come from nowhere, and I was not that woman. I was tired and cold and frightened, and there were nights when Clara wouldn't settle, and the range was being difficult, and the wind came through the gap under the front door in a way that no amount of rolled towels seemed to fix. And I sat on the kitchen floor and wondered what exactly I thought I was doing. But I kept the list. That was the thing. Every morning I looked at the list and I crossed off what I had done, and I added what needed doing, and I worked through it in whatever order made sense that day. The range I fixed with the help of a man from the village named Mr. Howarth, who repaired things for people and asked for a fair price and didn't make me feel foolish for not knowing how it worked. The roof I had assessed by his son, who told me the sag on the left side was superficial and the structure was sound. The windows I cleaned myself, one at a time, on the days when Clara slept long enough. The grazing rights lease was signed in November. Mr. Aldridge handled everything. The farmer who leased them, a man named Patterson, who had farmed the surrounding moorland for 30 years and had been trying to acquire the rights since my mother's time, came to the cottage to sign and shook my hand with the firm respect of someone conducting serious business, which was exactly what it was. The annual fee was more than Richard had earned in 6 months. I didn't think about Richard often, or I tried not to. But occasionally, in the evenings when Clara was asleep and the fire was going and the cottage was as warm as it got, I thought about him sitting somewhere with his calculations and his certainties and his new woman, and I felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite anger, but was somewhere between the two. The feeling of someone who has been underestimated so completely that the underestimation has become, in the end, a kind of gift. By February, the kitchen was painted. By March, the garden had been cleared, and the gate rehung and the path relaid with stones. I had dug out of the field and carried myself, 2 at a time, on the days when Clara sat in the carrier on my chest and seemed content to watch me work. Spring came slowly to the Yorkshire moorland, but it came. Richard came on a Tuesday in June. I saw the car from the kitchen window, too clean, too new for this lane, moving slowly the way cars move when their drivers are uncertain of where they are going. I watched it stop at the gate, and I watched him get out, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was almost nothing. Not anger, not hurt, something closer to the feeling you get when you see a place you used to live and realise it no longer belongs to you in any way that matters. He looked older. That surprised me. 6 months, and he looked noticeably older, which I suppose is what happens when the life you chose doesn't turn out to look the way you calculated it would. I went to the door before he knocked. He looked at the cottage, at the garden, at the repaired gate and the clean windows and the path I had laid stone by stone through the winter. His expression moved through several things. Surprise. Then something I might have called recalculation, the expression of a man updating figures that had stopped adding up the way he expected. "Heard you'd settled in," he said. "Yes, I did," I answered and added, "How on earth did you find me?" He didn't hesitate. He said, "I went to your mother's solicitor. He wouldn't tell me anything, so I checked the land registry. The address is public record. He looked past me into the cottage. He had never been good at silence. It made him fill space with words before he'd decided what he meant to say. Things didn't work out quite as I'd planned, he said. The house is more expensive to maintain than I expected. And, he paused, things with Sarah have been complicated. I looked at him. I thought about the morning he had thrown my mother's suitcase out the front door. I thought about him going through her papers and deciding the cottage wasn't worth mentioning. I thought about the phone box in October and Mr. Aldridge's voice telling me what the grazing rights were worth and the particular silence that had followed, and what I had felt standing there in the cold with Clara, asleep against my chest. I think you should go, Richard, I said. He blinked. I thought perhaps we could talk. About the situation. I shook my head. There's nothing to talk about. You were very thorough. You made sure of that. He tried once more. Something about practicalities, about things being different now, about whether there was any possibility, and I listened to all of it with the patience of someone who has spent a winter learning what they are actually capable of and no longer needs anyone else's assessment of it. Then I said, You went through my mother's papers and decided this place wasn't worth mentioning. You threw her suitcase out the door without looking at me. You left me with a 6-week-old baby and £11 and the absolute certainty that you had thought of everything. I paused. You didn't think of everything, Richard? And the answer is no. I don't want you here. He had no answer for that. He stood at the gate for a moment longer, looking at the cottage, at the moorland, at the life that had grown up here without him, and despite him, and in some ways because of him. Then he got back in his car and drove away. I stood at the door and watched until the car had gone. Then I went inside, put the kettle on, and picked up Clara, who had been watching proceedings from her blanket on the sitting room floor, with the serious expression she had recently developed for things she found interesting. We're all right, I told her. We're completely all right. She looked at me with her father's eyes and her grandmother's expression, and I thought, yes, we are. Epilogue. I have lived in this cottage for 3 years now. The roof no longer sags. The range works perfectly. I know exactly how it wants to be treated, which is more than I can say for most things I have trusted in my life. The garden grows vegetables in the summer and looks stark and honest in the winter, in the way that moorland gardens do, as if they have decided not to pretend to be something they aren't. I find I respect that. Clara walks now. She has been walking since January and has not slowed down since, which means I spend a significant portion of my days following her across the cottage and the garden, and occasionally the lane, where she has strong opinions about stones and puddles and the sheep that graze the moorland under Mr. Patterson's lease. She talks to the sheep. They regard her with the same mild interest they regard everything else, which she seems to find entirely satisfactory. The lease income has meant that I could take my time deciding what came next. I trained as a bookkeeper through a correspondence course, something I had always been good at and had stopped doing when Richard decided it wasn't necessary. I have 3 clients in the village now, and 2 more in the nearest town, and the work fits around Clara in a way that feels less like compromise and more like a life that was designed for the person I actually am, rather than the person someone else needed me to be. My sister came from Edinburgh in the spring. We had not spoken properly in 2 years, and the first afternoon was careful and slightly awkward in the way of people who have been apart long enough that they have to find each other again. By the evening, we were fine. Some things come back more easily than you expect when the reason they were difficult is no longer present. I think about my mother often. I think about her consulting Mr. Aldridge and updating her will and sewing that pocket into the lining of the suitcase and writing 4 pages in her careful slanted handwriting and hiding it there for me to find. She had no way of knowing I would need it. She had hoped I wouldn't. But she had prepared it anyway, with the quiet thoroughness of a woman who understood that love means thinking about what the people you love might need, even in the circumstances you hope will never arrive. I found her notebooks in the boxes in the small upstairs room. Decades of them, thoughts, observations, recipes, records of the land and the seasons and the small details of a life lived carefully. I have read all of them now. I am reading them again. She knew this place would be enough. She had said so in the letter. She was right. She was completely right. The key is on the hook by the door. I don't hide it anymore. There is nothing here I need to protect from anyone. Everything that needed protecting has already been protected by a woman who loved me enough to plan for the worst and wise enough to make sure the worst wasn't the end. I am not the woman Richard left on the doorstep with a suitcase and £11. I am not that woman at all anymore. I'm not sure I was ever going to be her for long. If this story stayed with you, leave it in the comments. Was it the hidden pocket? The letter? The moment she stood at the gate and watched him drive away for the second time? Stories like this one don't make the news, but they happen every day. In hidden pockets, in letters written by mothers who loved their daughters enough to plan for the storms they hoped would never come. New story every week. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.